Well, good afternoon. For this session, we have the largest audience. Yesterday and today, there have been many sessions, security-related sessions, where individual security issues have been discussed. But the uniqueness of this session is that we have to cover all imaginable security issues next year. What will happen next year? In the previous security-related sessions, individual issues were discussed by specialists, experts, so-called. But based on that, we have to predict what will keep us busy next year. But this is a tough task. Fortunately, we have 5 very outstanding veteran journalists covering this region. And I am sure that we shall have a very rich and meaningful discussion in this session. First, I would introduce our 5 panelists. To my left, Mr. Martin Feckler, Tokyo Bureau Chief of New York Times. You speak impeccable Japanese and Chinese, I understand.
Not Korean? I speak no language.
And Mr. Sebastian Falletti of Le Figaro. You are Seoul correspondent. Okay. He contributes to Jane's Defense Weekly, Financial Times, and he was based in Brussels covering for EU news. Then next to him, Mr. Sumida Takushi, Seoul Bureau Chief of Japan's Kyodo News Agency. He was already a Seoul correspondent from the year 2000 to 2003, hence he's a Korea expert. And Mr. Arten Sanjeev, Seoul correspondent of Rossiyskaya Gazeta, which is a Russian gazette, a government daily in Russia. Finally, Mr. Lee Byung-jong, or Byung-jong Lee of Korea, he's now a professor at the Sungmyeong Women's University and is a contributor to Newsweek. He used to work for Newsweek, South China Morning Post, Associated Press, Bloomberg, Newsweek. Our theme today is predicting a political developments in Asia Pacific in the year 2012. Last year, it was very, very turbulent year with North Korea's repeated provocations and clash between China and Japan on Senkaku Islands, etc. And compared to last year, this year is relatively quiet, but we are not sure until they predict it whether this quietness will be carried over until next year, or next year will be another repetition of last year, or even worse. So why don't we start with hearing each panelist making kickoff remarks for about 5 minutes, starting with Mr. Peckler.
Is this working? Thank you, Mr. Kim, and I'd like to say my thanks to the organizers of this event. You've heard all the professionals speak, and now you get to hear us. One of the freedoms we have is we can make ridiculous predictions, so here goes. In this conference, I've seen some of the literature and heard some of the panels, and there's a discussion, I think, for example, in the description of this particular event of elections in South Korea, the U.S., Russia. We've talked about succession in North Korea, and I've even heard talk about the changing of the guard in China when Hu Jintao's generation steps down and a new generation, perhaps led by Xi Jinping, takes power. One country that often seems to be avoided when we talk about political change is the country where I live, which is Japan. And so I think I'm going to start with Japan because I actually think it may be one of the more interesting countries going forward, at least in the short to medium term. People have made predictions about Japan in the past and have usually been proven wrong. Japan has this wonderful ability to sort of defy predictions of change and to keep sort of chugging along at its own pace and its own way. And it has seen this slow decline economically, but also in its prominence. I'm struck, for example, at the signage here, which is in English, Korean, and Chinese, but there's no Japanese. And just 20 years ago, that would have been unthinkable. You know, Japan was the premier power in Asia. Japan was China. And now, and I know this rankles Japan experts, but it seems to have become an afterthought. However, I think that we may see some possibilities or some potentials for change going forward. I'm going to take a risk here in predicting change in Japan, which I think is maybe suicidal. But after the March 11 tsunami and earthquake, and then particularly the nuclear accident that followed, we're always looking for Japan to reach some sort of breaking point. We're always looking for Japan to hit whatever stress or strain it is that finally forces it out of its complacency. At the national level, I think, unfortunately, this event has not done that. I don't think Prime Minister Khan has seized the moment. He has done some things like close down the Hamoka nuclear plant, but that's fairly minor stuff, I think, in terms of the broader picture. However, we're starting to see some interesting stuff at the grassroots and at the local level. And I can't go into it now because I think my time is limited, but let me just briefly point to one example in some of the cities in Fukushima Prefecture, which is where the nuclear plant, the crippled nuclear plant, is located. And these cities basically are defying a central government, not really an order, but the central government has set standards for what is safe for schools in terms of allowing children to play in the schoolyards. And they've set it at 20 millisieverts per year, which, before March 11, I had no idea what a millisievert was. And that's, but 20 millisieverts is basically the level that an adult worker in the United States is allowed to be exposed to if he works at a nuclear plant, which is a pretty high level. And you're talking about school children. This setting of 20 millisieverts per year as safe set off a bit of a rebellion in these local towns in Fukushima, where they've taken their own initiative to go in, replace the topsoil in schoolyards, and take various countermeasures. And it seems like pretty mild stuff, but in the Japanese context, it's pretty substantial because it's always been a very sort of centralized, top-down, bureaucratically led system, and what we're seeing now is local initiative. And local initiative driven by local outrage. Because if you look at the political dynamic of these decisions, they're angry parents who are concerned about the safety of their children. And if this sort of thing builds and increases, and if it continues where there's a perception that the safety of people is not being protected by the national government, that the national government is not taking enough steps to protect people, then maybe this sort of thing will continue in Japan. And so I think I'll stop there, but just raising the possibility perhaps not of a top-down sort of political change, but perhaps of a bottom-up change. And one of the outcomes of this may be, at the national level, the emergence of a second Koizumi-like character. Koizumi, of course, came in at the end of a financial crisis in Japan when there was a lot of frustration with political paralysis, that this thing had dragged on years and years and years, and Japan had gone through not one but two sort of financial crashes, basically. And finally, Koizumi came to power, and he came to power with promises to destroy the LDP. And he did a very good job. Maybe we'll see something like that again, because Koizumi was unique in Japan in that he was a populist, and he was able to kind of grab that zeitgeist, that national emotion in Japan, and channel it in a way that was became a political force. I also cover South Korea, and if I can briefly talk about political change in South Korea, I have no idea what's going to happen in the presidential election. I don't think the field is clear yet. I don't think we know the candidates yet. But I will point to two things that could be interesting. One is North Korea. We talked about this at lunch, but this election could end up in some way, shape, or form as a referendum of North Korean policy, South Korea's approach to North Korea. There are many who blame Lee Myung-bak for the current difficulties with North Korea, that in a sense he's taken us back to the Cold War and undone two previous presidents, the progress that they had with North Korea. On the other side of the coin, there are many people who, of course, blame North Korea, and understandably so. Young Pyong-do seemed to have an enormous impact on public opinion here because civilians were killed. And so what comes out of that? Will there continue to be a tougher line on North Korea, or will we go back to something like a modified sunshine policy? I don't know. But the election could become an important indicator or determiner of that. The other is the FTA with the United States. It's interesting that the U.S. had stalled and delayed the deal for a while, but I wonder if we will not see a deal signed this year or implemented this year because of South Korea and because of the election. I wonder if it just becomes too much of a political hot potato with an election coming up for people in the GNP to want to even touch it. I mean, given the size of the beef protests, and I mean, agriculture and a lot of these issues are very emotional. And so it may be that people just decide in South Korea to shelve the FTA until after the election. How much time do I have? One more? I'm done? Okay, I'm done. I was going to go into regional issues, but we can do that later. Thank you.
We'll come back to that with specific questions later on. Okay, Sebastian Faletti.
Hello, good afternoon. So me too, I'm quite happy to go for a ridiculous prediction, but I'm not sure. I will try to compete, but I don't have the experience of Martin, so I decided just to turn to Chinese astrology when I was preparing this chat, because maybe that's the most reliable tool we have to talk about the future of this region at this stage. Today we are in the year of the rabbit, which, as the chair says, seems to be quieter than the previous one. It was the year of the tiger. It would have been extremely tumultuous with the Chonan incident, with Yongpyong, though I'm talking here about the peninsula, obviously. Next year, I checked, next year is the year of the snake. So I was wondering, what does that mean? So the first thing I read, they were saying that during the year of the snake, you don't starve. So I thought that was a first interesting element when it comes to North Korea. Although it seems that the North Korean government is saying something different currently to the UN, partly to the US. But so that was the first thing. And then they say the year of the snake is a year particularly good for a good mediator. So it's supposed to be a year of deal making. Now, coming back as a journalist, I'm wondering if the conditions are there for a deal when we look at North Korea and if we look at the six-party talks. Today, if we look at 2012, I think we can say there's a fair chance that by 2012 the six-party talks maybe resume, because now we can see behind the scenes some effort in that direction. So maybe by the next 6 months, early 2012, we might have a meeting again of the six-party talks. That's a possibility. But then the key question is to do what, and will they deliver anything? And here, as the chair mentioned, obviously 2012 is fascinating because among the six parties, 4 of them will change their leadership. So basically North Korea has been faced with a kind of vacuum of power for them, because there's the US will be in the election campaign, China will change, South Korea will change, and Russia to 2012 will have some election. I don't talk about Japan because Martin did. But the key question, I think, is how North Korea will play out this situation. Because if we look in the past, if we, for example, look at the last US administration, like 4 years ago, the final year of George Bush administration was a very intense, interesting year on the diplomatic front with North Korea. The Bush administration made a push to make a breakthrough on the nuclear file. It was kind of unexpected for a president who had invented the axis of evil, but that's what they did. And North Korea played that game. So North Korea saw there was an opportunity with the president finishing his term and probably wants to leave a legacy. Maybe there was an opportunity for diplomatic opening. So the question whether we see the same thing in 2012. If we look at the situation in the US, I have my doubts, because I think President Obama is a very different situation than President Bush. He's going for re-election. He's not looking yet for a legacy. He's looking for re-election. He needs votes, and he's confronted with some grassroots Republican strong. The Republicans are already controlling the Congress, so he cannot afford to look like a dove. So it will be very difficult for him to make a great piece of virtue next year because of the election campaign. And then obviously the question is whether North Korea will try to use the election campaign as an opportunity to increase the pressure on Washington. That's the question. I think at the moment, the US, if you ask them, what do you want about North Korea next year? I think they want, like, no trouble, no noise. The Obama administration has already so many things to deal with. The Middle East, the Libyan war, they didn't really want to do it, but they had to do it. But the President Obama definitely wants to focus his campaign on the economy. And it doesn't need another crisis in somewhere else far away in the world where they have to explain to the voters why we're doing this or not doing this. So I think the US would be quite happy to have some low-level talks to keep the contact with the North Koreans, try to know what they're doing, and avoid at any cost a crisis that forces the president to take some dramatic measure. Then the second big player, obviously China. It would be very interesting to see how China react. I think I would expect that the next Chinese administration will definitely want to reaffirm the alliance with Pyongyang, because when they arrive, they want to show that there's continuity, and probably North Korea would like to do the same. But then behind the scene, what would be interesting is to know whether they're sending different message to their ally. But this is something that will probably not come out of the fore. And then South Korea, the elections, as you said, it's very open. It's very open, but obviously North Korea will be in the background, and we don't know how the parties here are going to play that card, but obviously I think that will be clearly there will be a different approach from the different candidates will definitely have a different point of view on this. The interesting thing is whether North Korea will try to step into the game, whether they will try to influence the game. One can argue that maybe North Korea has interest in seeing the opposition winning the election. So in that case, they also have interest not necessarily to go for a deal or to make big progress with the current administration next year. So if we look at this whole picture, I think this 2012 looks very volatile and not necessarily the best context for breakthrough and for major change. But then, obviously, we are all talking here. We try to put some rational, some kind of rational ideas on all this. But just as a conclusion, I would say we should never forget that there's a lot of. We tend to think there's a big master plan somewhere, that the North Koreans have a big strategy, know exactly what they're doing, and that the other actors are also in that approach. But there's also a lot of room for miscalculation. What happened last year, what really happened, we don't exactly know why we had this clash in Yongpyong, what was in the mind behind those people who did it. So the year of the snake might be for a good mediator, but it could be also for also some warriors or some more reckless profile who might be also very busy that year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sebastian. Now, 수미다 씨 부탁합니다.
예, 안녕하십니까. 저는 한국말로 편하게 하고 싶습니다. 먼저 오늘 이 자리에 저 불러주셔서 감사합니다. 그리고 먼저 저도 일본 사람이니까 일본에 대해서 말하고 싶은데, 저는 2012년은 큰 타닝 포인트가 될 해라고 생각하고 있습니다. 그거는 먼저 그런 자리에서는 바르은 전망, 희망을 두는 희망을 가질 수가 있는 전망을 말하는 게 적당할 것 같지만, 저는 2012년 이후의 세계, 특히 동아시아는 조금 어두운 미래가 시작하는 타닝 포인트가 될 해가 아니냐, 그렇게 생각하고 있습니다. 근데 물론 그렇게 되지 않은 거를 희망하고 있고, 역사는 바꿀 수가 있습니다. 과거 역사는 바꿀 수가 없지만 미래의 역사는 바꿀 수가 있습니다. 그러니까 각 지도자들이, 리더들이 그 문제를 해결하는 것을 기대하고 있지만, 개인적으로는 조금 여러 가지 문제가 많아가지고 어떻게 될지 모르겠습니다. 네, 먼저 일본에 대해서 아까 저보다 일본에 대해서 잘 아시는 분이 일본의 지금 상황에 대해서 언급하셨지만, 저는 일본 미래에 대해서는 희망은 있지만 그래도 어려운 부분이 너무 많습니다. 근데 일본은 그대로 가도 국가 재건 부재가 너무 많아가지고 어려운 상황이었지만, 이번 지진 그리고 후쿠시마 원전 사고 때문에 어려움이 또 일찍 현실화 될 것 같다고 그렇게 생각합니다. 네, 저는 자세하게 지금 말하는 시간은 없지만, 일본이 그런 어려움을 탈출하기 위해서는 저는 먼저 필요한 거는 세 개 있을 거라고 생각합니다. 근데 그거는 강력한 리더십을 갖고 있는 지도자, 정치 지도자가 필요하고, 아까 고이즈미 전 총리 이야기가 나왔지만 고이즈미 씨처럼 그 강력한 리더십 필요하다고 생각합니다. 그리고 더 중요한 거는 그 심플한 간단한 그 행정 조직하고 의사결정 제도, 그거가 제일 중요하다고 생각합니다. 지금은 일본은 너무 제도가 너무 복잡하고 수상 나오도 총리 한 명이 결정만 해도 다 그대로 일본 자체가 움직이는 거 아닙니다. 그거는 구조적인 뭐 시스템가 조금 문제가 있어가지고 그거 계획이 너무 필요한 거입니다. 근데 그리고 그 희망을 갖고 갈 수가 있는 그 복지제도나 그런 거가 필요합니다. 근데 결과적으로는 그 일본은 그런 큰 계획을 할 수 있는 정치인은 지금은 없고, 그거는 일본 정치 지도자가 정치의 프로지만 국가 지도자로서 갖고 가야 되는 여러 가지 필요한 그 능력이 그거 좀 부족하고 있다고 저는 생각합니다. 그것 때문에 큰 계획을 할 수가 아마 어렵고, 그것 때문에 일본은 점점 힘이 떨어질 것 같다고. 그리고 일본은 더 큰 리스크는 일본은 지금 일본 지진이 지난번에 있었지만 앞으로 뭐 내일 있을 수도 모르겠고 10년 후에 있을 수도 모르겠지만 큰 지진이 세계 역사적으로 보면 150년에 한 번씩 그런 큰 지진가 와가지고 그 큰 지진이 세계가 거의 동시에 아마 가까운 시일에 올 것 같습니다. 동경 직하에 큰 지진이 있고 서쪽 일본 도카이 지방 서쪽나 시국 지방 서쪽 규슈 가까이까지 뭐 넓은 범위에서 큰 지진이 올 가능성이 크문이다. 네, 그거에 그때는 일본이 진짜 어려운 상황이 되고 지금처럼 말고 너무 위기적인 상황이 될 수도 모르겠고, 그거에 대비해서 그런 강력한 리더십하고 정치 계획이 필요하고, 그거 없으면 뭐 어떻게 될지 모르겠습니다. 근데 그리고 일본이 그렇게 큰 어려움이 되면 그거는 일본뿐만 아니라 뭐 한국, 중국, 미국, 유럽 다 큰 영향이 미칠 것 같습니다. 그거는 지금 세계는 뭐 일본만에는 그렇게 프레젠스는 크지 않지만 사실은 일본은 미국 국제를 사고 일본하고 중국이 미국 국제를 사고 그 돈으로 미국은 국가 재원을 갖고 있고 운영되고 있고, 유럽 EU 나라 각국들도 일본 은행에서 많은 돈이 공급되고 그만에 이용하면서 여러 가지 국가 운영이 되고 있는 그런 만의 흐름이 있습니다. 그 흐름이 일본의 더 큰 지진이 오고 국가 위기가 되면 만의 흐름이 잘 되지 않고 뭐 미국, 유럽 그리고 아시아 각국도 어려운 상태가 생길 수도 모르겠고, 그거 일본이 세계 위기, 세계 경제 위기를 발생할 그거 계기가 될 가능성도 있습니다. 근데 그런 그거는 가능성이지만 그 현실적으로는 현실적으로는 그 확률이 어느 정도 있는 가능성입니다. 네, 그리고 북한 문제입니다. 네, 지금 그 동아시아에서는 아마 지진 때문에 일본하고 북한이 제일 큰 리스크, 단기적으로는 제일 큰 리스크가 되는 국가가 입니다. 근데 북한은 지금은 그 김정일 지난번에 그 김정일 국방위원장이 중국으로 방문하고 그 김정일 국방위원장이 그 권제강 프레젠스를 보여주고 지금은 그 권력 세습 가정 프로세스 있기 때문에 그 약간 그 북한이 그 제재가 그 불안하게 되지 않을까 그런 걱정 유려하는 사람도 있었지만 일단 김정일 국방위원장 공간 문제도 그 생각보다 그렇게 문제가 문제 아니다 그런 느낌이 좀 더 그 프레젠스를 보여주었습니다. 그거는 그 이번 반증에 대한 그 북한의 그 성과, 김정일 위원장의 그 큰 성과라고 생각합니다. 그렇지만 한편으로 북한은 그 지금 그 한국, 일본, 미국 제재를 그 받고 경제적으로도 어렵고 신량도 그 옛날에처럼 그 사르 지원도 못 받고 너무 어려운 상황입니다. 그거 그러니까 중국밖에 그 의존할 수가 없고 중국밖에 도움 줄 수가 있는 나라는 지금 없고 그런 상황을 그 잘 보여주는 중국 방문이었다. 그렇게도 생각하고 있습니다.
네, 감사합니다. 알텐스.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kim, for kind introduction. You said about us like veteran correspondents, and I suddenly felt that I'm very old. But I just celebrated 29th birthday a couple of weeks ago. Anyway, I just would like to express my personal opinion on some issues that we are discussing now. And first of all, because I represent here Russia, I just would like to tell a little about next year presidential elections. Actually, we will face two elections. First, general elections will be held this year, December. And from my point of view, I think they are much more interesting because now we have one ruling party. In English, we can just translate it like United Russia, and it has the total majority in Parliament, 315 seats among 450, and if it will keep the majority and people will support it, I just can say that the power will just and the policy, Russian government policy, will have no significant changes. In another way, if some opposition parties like Communist, Liberal Democratic Party, or some new opposition parties that are not represented now in Parliament will also get a significant part of seats, I think some changes can be made in case of internal Russian policy, but not foreign one. What about presidential elections? I think it's the most interesting question that many people all over the world interested who will be the next president, Medvedev, Putin, or somebody else. I think it's not so important because Putin or Medvedev will be president as Russian policy, political course will not be changed much. There are several causes why. Actually, if you know and look at the Russian government now, they are working in one team. One is the president, another one is the prime minister, and if there will be any shift in their positions next year, the course, economic, political, will be realized in the same way. Especially, it's related to modernization of Russian economy. President Medvedev 2 years ago already declared that it is very important to modernize Russian economy, and now our government just trying to implement this goal. Also, we have several important international events like APEC summit in 2012 and Olympic Winter Games in 2014. So to successfully implement these goals is the most priority now for the government. And another cause, there is no now alternative for president elections, no popular opposition leader. Of course, we have some minor opposition leaders, but they're not so popular, and people cannot support them in this big political race. What about Russian policy on Northeast Asia? I think it will be almost the same. In case of six-party talks, Russia always support non-nuclear status of Korean Peninsula, and we always support good relationships between two Koreas. So in this case, I think our government will continue some attempts to dissolve the North Korean nuclear problem, and will try to cooperate with North Korea to improve relations with South Korea, because these problems, at my point of view, they are interconnected, because if there is no good relations between two Koreas, to achieve the denuclearization of Korean Peninsula is very difficult. And another thing I just want to tell about, and I just was a little surprised that nobody said before, I think is the situation on Middle East. Sebastian already mentioned that this year is year of rabbit and it's rather calm, but I think if we can look at what is happening in the Middle East and Northern Africa, it's not seems so calm. And of course it will have some influence, maybe not so straight, but indirect to situation in China, I think, and maybe North Korea, because we already have some successful revolutions in Tunisia, Egypt, in Libya it's almost finished, and now Yemen, Syria. I think maybe Iran also can join in sometime to these all countries, and it will influence, I think, in rather significantly to China's situation, because Syria and Iran, they are allies of China and have close cooperations to this country, and if the power will be changed in these countries, I think it will influence in political and economic way on situation in China. What about Japan? Japan face now very big economic problems because of great disaster which was happened on March, and the nuclear catastrophe on Fukushima. But I think Japan has a very big economic power and potential. It's a third economy in the world. It can resolve this problem in 1 or 2 years. I'm not an economist. I can just count their definite terms and the size of this damage. But I think maybe the most important thing in this catastrophe for Japan is the energy problem. If it will just reconsider all this, it's a energy strategy, energy policy, and try to increase the part of renewable energy resources, like Naoto Kan, Japanese Prime Minister, said not so long time ago. I think it can make some influence on economic development of Japan, but in short term, I think, not long term. Yes.
Thank you. You have covered really a wide range of issues. Mr. Lee Byung-jong, please.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. I'm very pleased to be here, but I'm also at the same time a little, hesitant and cautious to make predictions about next year. As a journalist, we've been always covering, what's happening or has happened. We never covered what will happen in the future, but that's our job today. So I have to make some predictions about Korea and neighboring countries. We had a small session last night, hosted by the Global Asia, predicting year 2030. And some of us were there, and we were making very sort of wild and provoking predictions, because it's 20 years from now, and again we can be wrong and nobody will blame us, because 20 years later nobody will remember anything. But if we make any predictions today about next year, everybody will remember and will be liable for that. So I'm very careful, but it's not because of that. My prediction for next year about Korea and the region would be rather sort of status quo, basically. Nothing much can happen. We all know we have elections in many countries. I believe 4 or 5 countries out of the 6 nations related to North Korea have some kind of elections or power changes. But if you look at each one of these elections, I think there's not going to be much implications for policy changes, particularly for foreign policy changes. Because of the election in many countries and power changes, leaders in those nations in general, my view, will be rather reluctant to take any chances, any risks, basically. So they'll just try to muddle through during the year of 2012. But more specifically, we have this, again, I guess, Russia. He he talked about the relatively insignificant impact on Russia's foreign policy of these Russian elections. And Japan, there could be election and new leaders, but there will be, compared to South Korea, where election has very much implication for particularly foreign policy. Elections and power changes in other 4 or 5 nations would be rather insignificant, in my view. North Korea, whoever takes over, Kim Jong-un takes over, he will carry over his father's policy, as his father did, when he took over his grandfather's position, some 20 years ago. China again, there will be new names and new faces, but policy will not be that drastically different from the previous ones. But in Korea, if you look at past elections, for example, whenever we had a power change, we had major changes in our foreign policy. 10 years of liberal governments under President Roh Moo-hyun and President Kim Dae-jung, our policy toward North Korea was different, and our policy toward U.S. was even different, let alone China. And 4 years ago, after this new government took over, our policy, foreign policy, changed again tremendously. So that means Korean election is important. Every election in any country is important, particularly in Korea, because of this policy implications. I think it will be important. And on top of that, we have 2 elections next year. In April, there will be general election, and in December, presidential election. Again, very difficult to predict. I guess Martin was talking about the relevance of North Korea in Korean elections. I might disagree a little bit with him. Recent elections in Korea have more relevance with our economic status, and particularly this year, next year, my view is economic status, as well as the issue of growing, important issue of welfare would be a major factor as well. This was just shown during our by-elections not so long ago. So election itself could be decided more by non-North Korean issues like economy and welfare. But after the election is over, I believe the election result will have a lot of impact on our foreign policy. As I said before, whether we have a liberal government or a conservative government, that will change our course radically, of course. But again, the main election of presidential election is at the end of the year. So until that time, it will be all uncertainty and ambiguity. So that means no risk taking, no chance taking, sort of status quo. One event which we may have to watch carefully would be this upcoming International Nuclear Safety Summit in March in Seoul. I guess dozens of leaders will be here, just as they did for G20 last year. And here we will talk about a lot of important nuclear issues, nuclear safety following the nuclear crisis in Japan, and nuclear terrorism, following the death of Osama bin Laden, and also, of course, North Korean nuclear issue. This will be in March, just before our general election in April. And we also have to watch closely how North Korea will react to this summit of international leaders on the issues which which will talk about North Korea's bad behaviors. So combining all this together, a lot of uncertainties, but relative stability throughout the year, throughout the region. But there could be small disruptions, particularly for this nuclear summit and so on. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I have some specific questions related to those raised in the course of kickoff remarks. The first one goes to Martin Feckler. You said that Japan needs a second Koizumi style strong leadership. Could you give us 2 candidates specifically?
I think with Koizumi, what was interesting, if I think back to 2001, 2002, was it 2001, Sam? It was 2001, wasn't it? When he emerged, yeah. you didn't really see him coming. His predecessor was Prime Minister Modi, who was perhaps the most uncharismatic, wooden-headed individual to lead a major nation in quite a while. And Koizumi was at one point was sort of derisively referred to as henjin, which is like weirdo, by Tanaka Makiko, who has a knack for coining such descriptions. And people just didn't really see him coming. And he was able to kind of put his finger on something with his little sort of short, punchy comments and these sort of evening press conferences or sort of stand-up, press briefings he would give in the Prime Minister's office. And he did it with sort of a combination of sort of folksy, I feel your pain. And he also had this sort of conservative side to him where he insisted on going to Yasukuni Shrine. People who have that sort of potential, I don't know, but where I look for leadership in Japan, or at least as sort of a pool of potential leaders, I would look to the local leaders. I would look to governors and mayors, because in Japan, the local leaders are directly elected by voters. And so they tend to be stronger personalities. They tend to have mandates when they come into office. Hashimoto down in Osaka, the governor of Osaka, is one person who's talked about. The former mayor of Yokohama, whose name is now escaping me because I'm on stage, is another person. And there could be more to come out of that whole thing. But I think what's interesting is that the next person who comes, again, we may not see him coming. I don't really see sort of a looming figure on the horizon who would dominate politics now. But there is a potential. I don't think that the cupboard is entirely bare.
Thank you, Mr. Sumida. Is it possible for Ozawa Ichiro to come back as a leader? He would make a strong leader, but if his image is too much tarnished by the corruption, then who is your candidate to be the next strong leader?
먼저 오자와 씨 말인데, 오자와 씨는 자기의 리더는 어려울 것 같다고 생각합니다. 근데 그래도 일본의 몇 명, 아까 이야기 나오는 오사카프의 하시모토 지사, 그리고 나고야시의 가무라 시장라는 사람이 있습니다. 그 두 명은 자기 일본의 리더가 될 가능성이 있고, 그 나고야시의 가무라 시장하고 오자와 씨가 너무 가까운 사이입니다. 그러니까 그리고 그 가무라 시장하고 하시모토 씨가 연계될 가능성도 있고, 그러니까 다음 그 리더니 일본에서 그 지방 자치단체장 그 두 명이 리더가 되고, 그러면 오자와 씨가 그 리더들하고 연계될 가능성이 있고, 근데 그런 가능성이 있지만, 그렇게 연계되면 오자와 씨는 다시 어느 정도 큰 힘을 갖고 있을 가능성이 있습니다. 그래도 오자와 씨 자체가 전리가 되거나 그런 가능성은 조금 어렵다고 생각합니다. 그거는 아까 말씀하신 너무 어두운 이미지, 약간 부패한 사람이라는 국민적인 이미지 반발도 있고, 그러니까 지금 일본 국민은 개혁적인 리더를 강력한 힘을 갖고, 그리고 개혁적인 리더, 그리고 부패는 싫어한다. 그런 세 가지 조건이 있으니까. 네.
Thank you very much. I want to ask Sebastian and Lee Byung-jong if North Korea will try to affect the presidential election of South Korea by causing one trouble or another, or will they keep low profile, not to embarrass the opposition candidate? You first.
Well, obviously it's always difficult to know what is in their mind, but I will tend to go for the later, meaning I think North Korea doesn't have interest in if there's a repetition of a big clash. We've seen after the Yongpyong-do incident that clearly there was a shift in when we look at the polls in the survey in South Korea. Clearly the population rallied behind the administration, and it was in sharp contrast with the Chonan, because after the Chonan the public opinion was very much divided, but when it comes to Yongpyong, there was clearly a shift and which behind the current administration. So if they look at this, the logic is that they don't necessarily want to have this just side of election if they don't want to give a boost to the current National Party. But I think also we kind of, again, we should not underestimate the room for miscalculation. And yeah.
We are running out of time. Be brief, please.
Yes, I would also go for the latter because North Korea might be tempted to do something before the election, but they cannot really predict what kind of impact it will have on the South Korean elections. Sometimes it can work for the ruling party, sometimes it can work for the opposition party. Just as was seen by these two cases last year. Of course, it was different timing, different setting, but had different impact on the election. So, 20, 30 years ago, they could have predicted what would happen if they had provoked it. But it's a different situation. And also because, as I said in my remarks, because North Korea is becoming less important in South Korean elections compared to, economy and other pending issues, I don't think they will do anything stupid or strange. My view. And I hope so too.
Thank you. Art and Sanjeev, I have a question to you. In almost all security-related forums or symposiums, we talk a lot about Japan's role, China's role, America's role. But usually Russia's role or Russia's presence is under-discussed. Why is that so? In 2 minutes, please.
Actually, you are right. There are many different security forums, conferences in Korea, and I attended many of them. But I should say that not so many Russian experts are invited. I don't know why. Maybe the interest to Russian opinion is not so large here. Or maybe the South Koreans organizers underestimate Russian important role in this region. But I would like to stress that Russia played and is playing now the important role in this region. We are the part of Northeast Asia. We have a big territory. Maybe our economic influence in this region not so large like Chinese or Koreans or Japanese. And if you look to the population map of Russia, only 5% of population is living in the territory from Ural to Far East. But nevertheless, nowadays this region is developing very actively. And next year the summit of APEC countries will be held in Vladivostok. It's just near to the Korean Peninsula, and we still participating in six-party talks. COC, Shanghai Organization and different others discussions formats. So I think maybe nowadays the situation is formed in such a way that Russian presence is not so significant in Northeast Asia, and especially the security conferences that you mentioned. But in reality, Russia's policy is still strong in this region, and Russian government still have great interest to development of the cooperation with Asian countries.
Thank you. We have to address one big issue that is core issue for any security-related matters for this region. That is, everybody is asking, will North Korea eventually give up its nuclear weapons program? If not, what's the point of restarting six-party talks? 2 minutes, okay, each of you. You start. Yes.
This question? No, I don't think they will.
They won't. Then
No,
why
would
do
they?
why do we?
I wouldn't. If I had nuclear weapons, I wouldn't give them up. I mean, look at Libya. Look at what happened. They were supposed to be the test case, right?
What's the point of having six-party talks?
Good question. It would save me from having to write about them because they're tediously boring.
Okay.
No, but seriously, if you look at Libya, Libya was supposed to be the case of the country that gave up its weapons and got all the wonderful benefits. And look what we did. We bombed them. So if I were the leader of North Korea, I'd be like, no way. I can't imagine them giving them up.
Sebastian?
I also think they won't give up their nuclear weapons, and I will do the same. But I think they're probably going to be a resume of six-party talks because both China and to a lesser extent the US now see some interest in having at least some kind of talk. I think China, it's obvious they've always been pushing. But the US now, last year, have been really tough and say we're not going to go back to talks or nothing. But now they're realizing it's maybe better, at least we can exchange some information, know where they are, especially when it comes to this enrichment program. So I think there's a slight change of mood where they're starting to think, at least if we have some chat, it's better than nothing.
Sumida-san.
저도 그 북한은 저대로 핵을 포기하지 않을 것 같다고 생각합니다. 제가 김정일 국방위원장이라면 핵을 포기하지 않습니다.
그럼 식스팟 육자회담은 왜 합니까?
육자회담은 그 의미가 없는 거 아닙니다. 그 육자회담에서 그 협상하면서 그 핵을 완전히 핵을 포기하지 않아도 어느 정도 핵을 그 관리할 수가 있는 그런 방향을 모색하는 그런 의미가 있을 거라고 생각합니다.
Arten.
Yeah, Mr. Kim, you asked a very important question, and it's not so easy to answer to this question. I think everybody knows that the final goal of six-party talks is the denuclearization of Korean Peninsula, and but I think the situation now is so complicated that it's impossible to achieve this goal. And as I understand, now I just talked to some experts, especially Americans. There is some shift in the approach to this problem, and now their priority is not the final total denuclearization of North Korea, but they're realizing some goals of non-proliferation. We have Syria, we have Myanmar, and some maybe other countries who want to develop their nuclear programs. And in that case, North Korea maybe can be the proliferator of this knowledge and some materials. And the United States is very concerned about this problem. And you know, President Obama, he just declared several years ago the world without nuclear. And next year there will be a nuclear summit in Seoul. So I think it is now very important for United States and of course for other countries to restart six-party process, and maybe if we are talking about prediction, I think maybe the end of this year or beginning of the next year it can be happened. And I agree with my colleagues that North Korea will never give up their nuclear weapons, because they just already realized what happened with Libya, who did this several years ago, and now they just maybe they are ready to go forward to stop their nuclear development program, but not to give up their already made nuclear weapons. Yeah. Mr. Lee Byung-yong, please.
I basically agree with what my colleague said. They're not going to give up nuclear weapons. They've gone through all these problems. I don't think they're going to give up anytime soon. That gives us the question: why do we have six-party talks? It's a very important question. I myself doubt the effectiveness of six-party talks a lot, but as they all pointed out, non-proliferation is a major issue. And also, we can somehow change the characteristics of the talks. Now that North Korea is a de facto nuclear state, we can shift our focus on something else. The other thing is, North Korea is such a dangerous country. It's so dangerous to be left alone. We need to have some kind of ongoing talks to find out what's happening in North Korea, what they're thinking about. And just for that reason, I think there's a reason for the existence of the six-party talks for the moment.
Very much. We have just 5 minutes left, and I want to open the debate to the floor. If you have any questions, comments, be very brief, please. Oh, yes.
In the last panel, General Pan was talking about the importance of reconciliation as a means of creating a multilateral security framework in Northeast Asia. What role do you think the media, not necessarily the media of your host countries, of your home countries, but the media of the countries you're covering, China, Japan, and Korea, play in either facilitating that reconciliation or acting as an obstacle?
I missed that particular presentation. I was trying to see Sam's presentation, but there was no English. I mean, in terms of like a regional integration, that's the issue. And what would media be an obstacle or a facilitator of that? That's the idea.
I'm thinking more in terms of historical reconciliation between the countries. Right. So not institutions, but really moving beyond history and contentious issues of national identity.
I think we've gone a lot. We have moved quite a bit beyond some of those issues where we were, say, 5 or 10 years ago. And to give some credit, the Yomiuri Shimbun had they put together a book, and they did some work on what happened during the war and Japanese responsibility. So I think that the media has played a positive role, at least in Japan, with some of these things. But the media as a driver, I don't know. I don't. I have a hard time with that concept of the media as a driver. I tend to think it's more like in the case of Japan. If I can talk about Japan again, it tends to be the political leadership and also the mood of the country and perhaps even the state of the economy at that time. So. It's easy to blame somebody else for your problems, and it's easy to kind of to look abroad for someone to beat up on when you have difficult issues at home, and that's true of any of these nations. So I don't know if the media really is a driver of this dynamic.
Sunny Lee of Korea Times.
Sunny Lee from Beijing. I'm a Korean guy who is stuck in China. So some of the comments that I just want to reflect some of the Chinese perspective, because as I have been talking with some Chinese scholars regarding whether there is any possibility that North Korea will engage in any provocation during the South Korean presidential elections. Chinese scholars told me that would really piss off the Chinese people, Chinese government, because it also depends on the dynamics between China and North Korea. But then China has been tolerating North Korea, and that would really piss off, and that might fundamentally change the dynamics between China and North Korea, because China is a sponsor of North Korea. But then they also point out that they are not going to directly attack South Korea because in the aftermath of Yeonpyeong, South Korean public's perception toward North Korea really deteriorated. So they might do a third nuclear testing, which is not a direct provocation to the South Korea. So that might be a possibility, depending on how the situation flows. Russia's influence is also Chinese scholars' perspective. There's no Chinese scholar here, so I can't talk about it. I think Russia lost influence in North Korea in 1991 after they established diplomatic relations with South Korea. Russia at the time calculated that they used South Korea to develop the Far Eastern area, and they thought that having a diplomatic relations with South Korea and using the South Korean economy, and will boost, develop the northeastern region of Siberia, Far Eastern region, but that didn't happen. And at that moment, Russia took a unilateral, one-sided, favoring policy toward South Korea that lost Russia's influence on North Korea. And my question to Smita Shensheng, I just realized that these days very interesting happening in East Asia, even though China and the United States are competing for leadership in East Asia, but there is also very interesting phenomenon that Japan, also China is the historical rivals in East Asia. They are competing each other. And I just wonder, China is really kind of interested in having South Korea close to the Chinese side, and what kind of strategies that Japan, or inducement Japan is going to use so that South Korea is not going to get closer to the Chinese side. Is there what kind of strategies or perceptions do you have? Thank you.
사실은 일본은 중국하고 여러 가지 지금 경제적으로는 경쟁 관계가 있어가지고 그래도 일본, 중국, 한국은 경쟁하는 부분도 있지만 협력해야 되는 경제적으로는 협력해야 되는 부분도 많고. 안보 분야에서는 그렇지도 않고 조금 복잡한 관계가 있습니다. 근데 경제적으로는 동아시아 공동체 지향하면서 한중일 FTA나 그런 거 실현하기 위해서 노력해야 된다고 생각합니다. 그리고 안보적으로는 일본은 별로 다른 카드는 없습니다. 카드는 없는데 안보 분야에서는 일본은 한국하고 일본이 협력하고 중국하고 여러 가지 안보 문제는 해결해야 된다고 생각합니다. 그거는 중국이 힘이 고지기 때문에 동아시아의 밸런스를 유지하기 위해서는 일본하고 한국이 여러 가지 협력하면서 중국하고 대치해야 된다고 생각하고 있습니다. 그거가 일본의 카드 아닐까요?
Thank you. I was hoping to answer to your question about media's role in this East Asian situation. You're looking at this people from mass media, but I think our role and influence in this area of the internet is diminishing very rapidly. Maybe you have to address that question to these social network service, media people and online journalists. We just had a session previously about that and what these Chinese netizens in the cyberspace are going to do about this, security issues. We are very much divided. Some say that there will be Chinese, for example, netizens will go for sort of universal values, supporting human rights and all that. On the other hand, some people were saying that they'll be indulged more in sort of nationalistic sentiment. I think that was.
Can I some remark to?
Can you do that in 1 minute?
1 minute, yeah.
Okay.
The question of my colleague about the Russians' role in dealing with North Korea. I think you are, of course, right that relationships between Russia and North Korea now are far from that there were between Soviet Union and North Korea, and there were serious causes: the collapse of Soviet Union and the East European countries bloc, and just showed to North Korea what can be happened with them. You know, Ceausescu and their Albanian leader, who are very close to Kim Il-sung, maybe became very great shock to North Korea. And after that, as you said, the policy of Russian government, new democratic Russian government, changed to development relations with North Korea, because we are waiting to South Korea, because we were waiting some investment to our economy from South Korea, but this hopes they were not realized then. And some Russian scholar also just named this period like democratic romanticism. New Russian government just thought that it was so easy to establish relations with South Korea and to get some economic gain, but it wasn't so easy, and there were some problems, very significant. But about 10 years passed, and in 2000 we signed new treaty with North Korea, and our relations began more and more better. But still, it's not so good like before. And I just can stress the one point. Nowadays, China can provide North Korea economic aid. I think very significant economic aid and investment to its economy, North Korean economy. But Russia nowadays don't want to investment to North Korean economy, because we need investment by ourselves. We have very huge territory at Far East and Siberia, and some natural resources that should be development. And I think maybe nowadays it's the main cause that North Korea just listen to China more, because economic influence on this country is much more bigger than Russian one now.
I'm sorry that we have run out of time. Our time was up 8 minutes ago. Okay. No, I'm sorry. And I thank you all for your wonderful presentations and your patience. And why don't you join me in thanking them? So thus I conclude the whole session. Thank you very much.